Hi, I'll be sharing today some thoughts on design thinking for data collection in multilingual environments. So to start with two concepts from design thinking. The first is the co-evolution of the problem and the solution, when problem-oriented thinking and solution-oriented thinking are differentiated from each other as part of the design process. The second is iterative design grounded in empathy for the participants of our eventual tools. So this is taking into account how the experience of our end user is going to be while we are actually designing the tool and adapting it so that it's most suitable for them and their interests, as well as our research needs together. So I want to start by thinking about a tool that many of us are familiar with, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. Now, this fantastic tool is a straightforward checklist for parents to fill that has many, many different words, and depending on the age of the child, a parent can mark off whether it's a word that their child understands or a word that they understand and also say. This means we're collecting data about individual children and individual words simultaneously. So this gives us the capacity to build up norms for vocabulary size, to differentiate between children on the basis of vocabulary size, and potentially even identify those children who might be at risk of language delay or disorder. It also means we have the same kind of information about individual words. How early are they acquired? And what is their trajectory across early years development? This allows us to identify individual words for use in future studies that are age appropriate and to find out general properties of lexicon development. We can also combine together these two streams into whether an individual child knows an individual word. In my own research, I've investigated whether parents are correctly identifying which words their children are able to pick out in an eye gaze task, whether we can find hints of pre-lexical activity when children are looking at pictures that their parents say they either do or don't know the names of, and also looking at whether that pre-lexical activation might be part of a pattern of spreading activation that we can detect using priming in the toddler years. However, moving to new research contexts has new research challenges. So Singapore is a deeply multilingual country with 4 official languages. The official census data shows that across the board, around 30% of families report that English is the language they use most at home, but other languages are strongly represented for the different ethnic groups. However, when we look in more detail within each household, the majority of families speak to their infants in a mix of their different languages, and the diversity here is really high. So what does this mean for a tool like the Communicative Development Inventory? Well, the established tool has been developed with a certain set of conditions in mind, and we might think, how can I use this tool? I have a problem, it's been developed somewhere else. Can I make it useful to my new context? The traditional approach is to translate and adapt the tool into different research contexts. And the assumption here is that the resulting tools will have the same utility and applicability in the different research contexts that they are applied. However, because there was a research context present during the design phase, there are elements of that research process context that are still evident in the resulting tools. And the context in question is the English language. And there are a bunch of assumptions that go along with an English language research environment. The first is that the community are majority monolingual, that there's a written language that represents the spoken language more or less effectively, that you can check the standard forms of the written language using dictionaries, and you can check prevalence rates for different items using corpora, and that literacy rates are so high within the community that people will be able to navigate the written language easily and effectively. This flows through into tool design with assumptions like the idea that one tool is sufficient, text is sufficient, spelling is never in question. There are always backup data sets to check your assumptions against, and that participants will find interacting with text easy. In the multilingual environment, if we take just that first assumption that one tool is sufficient, one of the approaches that we can take is to try to create just one tool that has all of the languages together. Now we have problems with translation equivalence, as we can see in this example here, where the English word cut has two distinct meanings that can be represented in Chinese. This little screenshot is a locally adapted version of a CDI tool that has English, Bahasa Melayu, and Mandarin Chinese together. And we see that some items end up being repeated because the translations may be duplicated across multiple items. So this makes counting vocabulary quite complicated. Do we count twice if it was ticked twice, or once for each concept or each lexical item? An alternative approach is to create separate lists for each of the languages. So we might have one for English, one for Mandarin Chinese, and one for Malay, etc., etc. We also have the question of which words to include, and this is where the iterative design process is critical. So in our lab, there are many steps to our iterative design process. We start with elicitation, followed by some kind of validation checks with informal networks of friends and parents. There's the formatting process that follows our sanity checking, followed by expert validation by people who work with children of the age groups of interest, so that we know we're polling outside of just each individual's linguistic experience range. And only after we've done that checking are we able to move towards a small scale pilot. After the pilot, we're able to bring what we've learned from the user experience back into our tool design and refine it. And only then are we able to roll out something that's ready for public consumption. So you can see there are many stakeholders involved in the design process. And at each stage, we try and ensure that there's not just one user of each of the languages in question, so that they are able to do some consultation among themselves. At the end of this process, we have a tool that we are using in this 150 family longitudinal sample. Some of the challenges that we've faced just in developing this tool, though, include unbalanced literacy and problems of the formality or standardization of the different elements that are in the tool itself. So the spoken variety of Mandarin in Singapore is not the same as mainland Mandarin. It's heavily influenced by other regional varieties, meaning that there isn't always a standard written form for every word in Chinese characters. And there isn't necessarily a standardized transliteration in English letters that we can use either. And there are no resources that we can check. There's no official dictionary of Singapore Mandarin. When it comes to the question of which language in which format and whether we can work with separate lists, we also have the challenge of what to do with words that appear across lists. So we know that English-speaking and Mandarin-speaking families use a hefty handful of Malay words in their day-to-day language use. Which list do they go on? Or does everyone have to look through every word of each of the 600 item checklists in order to get our smattering of code switching and code mixing effectively? And we have to kind of ask ourselves the question, are these languages actually in the minds of our speakers truly separate? Or does each language user float on a sea of words of many different colors from which they can sample freely at any time? So this brings us back to the question of problem-oriented thinking. How can I use this tool? How can I adapt the existing format? And maybe we need to be asking ourselves the solution-oriented question. What is the tool that I actually need? So if we go back to those research objectives that the CDI helps us to achieve, norms for child vocabulary size, norms for individual lexical items, maybe if we downrate the total vocabulary size agenda, we can get on with answering these questions using different methods. So targeted surveys for age of acquisition estimates, checking with experts for estimates of age of acquisition for individual study items, pre-study checklists for individual children taking part in individual studies. And maybe we can get at the process of screening children who may go on to have language or developmental difficulties via other robust methods in the literature, such as phoneme categorization skills. Once we have all of these tools under our belt, it might be possible to develop more effective tools than the large-scale CDIs for microsampling, such as the Wordful app that's being developed by Michael Frank's team at Stanford. In addition, we're also working on building up a corpus so that we have some backup for oral language use that is relevant to developmental studies and future tool development. So we're developing a suite of tools for multi-tier, multilingual transcription of parent-child conversations and a processing pathway that allows us to visualize what is the nature of language mixing or translanguaging among individual households, and automated language tools that allow us to compute certain linguistic variables of interest. We're also working with engineers to help us refine a processing pathway for possible language detection in an automated system, a little bit like Alexa. But this brings us back to the question of what we do with finding out information about individual words. Maybe if our linguistic informants are floating on a sea full of individual words like this bow, perhaps we can imagine tools that, rather than being individual or discretized lists, contain all the fish in all their multitudes at different depths and in different sizes, maybe different shapes, depending on which languages are more prevalent for an individual speaker or their household, that might allow us to capture the full diversity of how our actual participants feel about their linguistic resources. So to return to those two themes, the first idea is that the problem and the solution may co-evolve together when we can separate the problem-oriented thinking from the solution-oriented thinking. And that this iterative design process is grounded in empathy for the participants who are our key stakeholders in our research. But we should bear in mind throughout this process that the approach is very costly in terms of time and requires skilled trainees who have been the beneficiaries of high levels of education. And this burden is not equitably, nor is it equally distributed across research environments. And this is something that we as a community of scholars need to think about how we will address going forward into the future. Thank you very much for your attention.